Hello, this is a synopsis of Chapter 4. Chapter 4 deals with what is called extent decisions, which means how much a firm should produce. And so what we're dealing when we talk about how much a firm should produce is we're dealing with what we call marginal analysis. So the main point, try to get that off there. All right. So the main point of this chapter is that average costs are irrelevant in the extent decision, meaning that average costs include fixed costs. So if you're trying to figure out if you should produce additional products or provide additional services, when you do a cost benefit analysis, if you're comparing the revenue of more production to your average cost, that's wrong, because average costs include fixed costs, and the more that you produce, your average cost will naturally go down. So in order to compare apples to apples, you need to compare marginal revenue to marginal cost. Marginal cost is the cost of producing one more item. Marginal revenue is the revenue received from producing and selling one more item, and is marginal cost. Marginal cost is the cost of producing and selling one more item. Marginal revenue is the revenue that you get from producing and selling one more item. So in other words, if you go from producing 10 widgets to 11 widgets, going from 10 to 11, you're going to measure, you're going to compare your marginal cost against your marginal revenue. So when you're reviewing this chapter, make sure you look at the hospital example on page 38. It's a real good example that explains why we don't use average cost when we're trying to figure out how much of a service we should provide, or a company should provide, or how much of a product they should produce. So, and they explain that only marginal costs are relevant. And again, marginal cost is the additional cost of producing and selling one more unit. Marginal revenue is the additional revenue gained from selling one more unit. All right, so according to marginal analysis, if the benefit of selling another unit is larger, in other words, if the benefit of selling another unit is larger than the cost, then you should continue to produce more. So in other words, if marginal cost is less than marginal revenue, or if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, you should sell more. You sell more up to a point when marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue. And if you get to that point where marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue, then you drop back down. So what this means is that profit maximization occurs where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So there's a homework problem where you're going to see, it's going to ask you how much should this company produce? And so you're going to look at the marginal cost and the marginal revenue, and where that equals, that's where you should produce. Or if you keep going until you get to a point where marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue, then you drop back down. Okay, so just to repeat, the main point of this chapter is that if you're trying to figure out how much you should produce of a product, or how much of a service you should produce, or you should provide, you look at marginal revenue versus marginal cost. And if marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, hang on a second, I'm sorry. If marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, you're going to continue to sell more. You keep selling more up to a point where marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, or marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue. So once your marginal cost exceeds your marginal revenue, you're not making, it doesn't behoove you to produce one more unit. So you would stop and go back to the lower part. As long as you're making money, you continue to produce more. And when marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that's when profit is maximized. All right, so that's the theory. Now let's look at a practical example. So think about the number of, and this is going to explain why eventually marginal cost exceeds marginal revenue. And also marginal revenue with each addition, marginal revenue is increasing, but at a decreasing rate, and then eventually it decreases. So let me explain what I mean by that. Think about bartenders behind a bar. Okay, so you own a bar, you hire one bartender. The bartender can't keep up. So then you hire two bartenders. So obviously, if you think about this bar, if you have two bartenders, now you don't have one bartender trying to do everything. You can maybe delineate, and you've got maybe the first bartender is serving customers, the second bartender that you just hired is doing backup, maybe making the drinks, what have you. So it's a lot more efficient. So you can see how going from one to two bartenders, your marginal revenue would be much greater than your marginal cost. Now you go to three bartenders. Now you can maybe have one making the drinks, one serving, one on the register, or what have you. So your marginal revenue is still greater than your marginal cost. You go to four, you still probably have marginal revenue greater than marginal cost, but you see your marginal revenue is increasing at a decreasing rate because you're not getting the benefit. Going from one to two gave you much greater benefit when you look at marginal revenue versus marginal cost than going from, say, 3 to 4. So let's say you go to 5, and that's basically it. That's when your marginal revenue equals your marginal cost, or you're getting close there. If you go to that 6th bartender, now you have a fixed capacity right here, this fixed asset problem. You only have one bar. You only have a fixed amount of space. And so going, hypothetically, if you hire that 6th bartender, they're not as productive because it's just too many people in the kitchen, so to speak. So at that point, your marginal cost would probably be greater than your marginal revenue. So that's the whole point of when you think about marginal analysis, that, what I mentioned up here, and then this is kind of a hypothetical. This is more of a real world example to explain it. So you can also think about a company that is producing widgets. They, in the short run, meaning during a period of 1 year, they can add, if demand is increased, they can produce and produce and produce until marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But there's only so much that they can produce because there's only so many people that they can fit into the plant. In the long run, they could really increase their production, though, by building another plant. So that's what we mean by this fixed asset problem. All right, so this is the main point of the chapter, this section right here. All right, then also take a look at the example on page 42, and it deals with, that is it deals with some manufacturing companies in Latin America. That's kind of an interesting example. Again, dealing with marginal revenue versus marginal cost. Okay, and then in the last section, they talk about how marginal analysis is used to incentivize people. In other words, marginal analysis is also used to encourage hard work. So you can incentivize people by giving them bonuses for productivity and so forth to try to increase this marginal revenue. And so if you make sure you look at sections 4.4 and 4.5. Also in section 4.6, it discusses the unfairness of incentive pay. So one example is if you think about employees who were hoping to cash in their stock options. So let me explain. I might have talked about this example earlier in the semester, but let me just explain it again. So one way that companies incentivize managers is to give them stock options. Stock options is the right to buy a stock at a specific price. And so the idea is that the employees or the managers will work, that their goals will be aligned with the shareholder goals, and that they'll work really hard to make sure the company is profitable, and which therefore would increase the stock price. So they work real hard and they're motivated to try to increase the stock price. So the idea is, let's say, for example, the stock is selling for around $100. You can't give a bonus, or you can't give a stock option that's less than the current price. So, excuse me, let's say the stock's selling for $100 a share. It's the end of the year. They give managers all these stock options, which gives you the right to buy the stock at $100 a share. They expire in 3 years. All right, so fast forward 3 years, the managers have worked real hard and the stock is up to $200 a share. It's doubled in price in 3 years. Well, the managers now can sell, they can exercise their options, which means it gives them the right to buy it at 100, but it's really worth 200. So they could turn around and sell it, the stock, for 200 and make a 100% profit, or they can just keep it. So the point that I'm making here is that what happens if we're in a recession, or for whatever reason, what happens if due to inflation or whatever reason, the stock market in general declines? And these managers have worked really hard, but they're caught in a market decline and the stock price is actually down in 3 years. So their options are worthless. So that's one example of how these macro factors could affect incentive pay. And so that's a really demotivating factor for managers if they have all these stock options, but they can't exercise them. They're not going to make any money because the market's down. Conversely, they might see, employees who have been there longer, or managers who have been there longer, who were there during a run up in the market when they made all this money. And so it's kind of an option. So it's kind of demotivating. Anyway, make sure you read these 3 sections. Of course, all these chapters in the book are pretty short. And that just talks more about how marginal analysis is used to encourage hard work. Okay, now talking more about unfairness and some inefficiencies dealing with incentive pay. In section 4.6, they talk about Spain. Spain has a policy called finiquito. This is really crazy. Well, when you think about it, the reason the government instituted this, obviously, I say here, why would they adopt such a policy? Well, first let me explain what it is. So basically, what this is, and Mexico has a similar policy, but in Spain, if you fire a worker, you have to pay them 1.5 months of salary for every year that they've worked. Mexico has a similar policy. If you want to fire somebody, you have to pay them out the severance pay. So anyway, think about that. If somebody has worked, if you 1.5 times 10 is 15 months. That's almost 1.5 years or 1.25 years of pay that they would have to give somebody. If somebody's worked there for 20 years, you're looking at 30 months of pay that they would have to give you. So so the reason this was instituted was because they wanted to give employees job security, and they didn't want employers to be able to just fire people whenever they felt like it. They wanted people to have some job security, but it's really disincentivizing people, because some people who have worked for a company, say 20 years, they're trying to get fired because they want to get all the severance pay. And so it really has become a really demotivator in the workforce and for people who have a long tenure at a job. So anyway, that's kind of a crazy thing. Of course, these economists or whoever, these policymakers in Spain and in Mexico too, when they thought up these policies, they didn't think about, well, people are going to behave based on incentives. And the longer you work at a company, even though it is kind of unethical, people are not, in general, are not going to be as motivated to work if they know they can get a big payout if they get fired. So it's just the opposite of trying to motivate people. Whereas, the government was thinking, well, this will motivate people to be, a good worker, and then they'll have job security that should make them more loyal, but it really hasn't worked out that way. Okay, so anyway, this is the chapter 4 deals with marginal analysis. So just remember, a company should sell more as long as marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. They should sell less if marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue. And when marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that is when profit is maximized. And the reason why we look at marginal revenue and cost versus average cost is because average cost includes fixed costs. So the more you produce, your average costs are going to go down. You're not really, it's not really irrelevant. You're not comparing apples to apples. And if you look at this hospital example on page 38, read that. That'll make it clear why companies should not be using average cost, why they should use marginal cost in this marginal analysis. Okay, so that's it for chapter 5, and I will see you next time, or I'm sorry, chapter 4, and I'll see you next time when we discuss chapter 5.